Just gonna look at you for a minute. Good to see everybody. There really is something about seeing a smiling face, and it's a joy and a pleasure to be able to be together and to see you this way. A speaker really does draw a lot of feedback from facial expression, and it's going to, I think, help me feel more engaged with you today and the weeks to come. If you're visiting with us this morning, you might look around and say, well, it's a nice congregation, but where are all the young people or all the middle school and high school students? Well, this time every year, Janice and I and some other individuals come together to provide a camp for our middle and high school age students. And that's this weekend. And so I've been out at what we call Camp Forge the last couple of days, shouting and running and exhausting myself. But I'm glad to be here with you this morning. They're finishing up out there and will be back with us tonight. But I just want to say to you about the young people here and the experience that I've had with them this week, not just the fun and the games, and enjoyable as that is, but the robust spiritual experience that we have had with them, extremely powerful, and I believe that something very good is happening at Lost River with our young people. We have some of the most godly and spiritually focused young people that I have ever been around in my life. And they're having opportunities to connect with other families that are out there working with them, with a number of college students also who are pouring themselves into these kids and building those relationships. And then some studies that I've read over the last few years, one of the things that will indicate whether a young person in that very perilous transition between high school and college, whether they retain their faith or not, is as dependent on this as anything else, whether or not they have formed strong relationships with some people other than just their family members who are a little bit older than they are. For whatever reason, that seems to be something that if that bond can be built, that will help keep people in the faith more than just about any other factor that you can measure for. And so I want us all to be as engaged with our young people as we can. Every one of us should try to go out of our way to build as strong a relationship with them as we can, because they are living in a crazy world and they're going to be facing all kinds of struggles and temptations in the years to come. And the more that we can connect with them, the more of that bond that we can build, the better it's going to be, both for them and, of course, for us as well. Well, this morning, I want to begin by asking you a simple question. When have you felt most alone? When have you felt most alone? In your whole life, looking back, what was some of, if not the loneliest moment in your life? There were a few things that came to mind to me as I thought about that. I remember once as a kid, like a kindergarten, first, second grader, maybe somewhere in there, I don't remember exactly. My mom was a stay-at-home mom, but for a very short period of time, she decided to take a job at the local library in Hereford, Texas. And so when I would get out of school, instead of going home, which I love to do because my mom was just the greatest homemaker, but instead for that few months, I would go to a babysitter's house, and she was a sweet older lady, and she kept a couple of other kids after school. But it was in the wintertime, and I remember it would get dark before Mom would come to pick me up. And as it would get darker, I would just start feeling lonelier and lonelier. And even though I was around some other people, it was just a terrible feeling, and breaks my heart to just remember back as a little kid how I felt and so lonely. When I was in high school, I lived in New Mexico for a couple of years and made a backpacking trip all by myself for 3 days into the Kit Carson National Forest, just wilderness, and did not see another human being for 3 days. And I enjoy being alone, but 3 days, and when you're out there in the wild, things begin to work on you psychologically. And again, I remember getting back home finally at the end of 3 days and seeing my mom again, and how beautiful it was to see somebody and to talk to somebody again. And in my adult life, the ironic thing is that I'm not often alone very much anymore, but sometimes when I go on gospel meetings, I think that's the loneliest I am now. Because often I'm in a place where I'm surrounded by people, but they're people I don't really know. And isn't it true that sometimes you can feel the loneliest when you're surrounded by so many other people? And then you spend certain amounts of time alone in a hotel, and it's not all it's cracked up to be as you think about it as a young preacher going to preach gospel meetings. But what about you and loneliness? When have you felt the loneliness? When do you feel the loneliness? Maybe for some of you that's going on right now. And it's a painful thing to experience, loneliness. But we're in the middle of a series of lessons that hopefully is God's antidote for this peculiar thing that we call loneliness, and it has to do with a one another focus. When we see that what God has done for us sort of in this vertical relationship is to be turned outward and experienced in a one another relationship, as the Bible over 100 times calls upon us to, in one way or another, one another, to be mindful of one another, to care for one another, to encourage one another, to build and lift one another up. And so we're to have this one another consciousness. And in doing so, the theme of this whole series is this idea that we want to care for what Jesus died for. We want to care for what Jesus died for. And we know that Jesus died for people. And certainly Jesus died for lonely people. Jesus died for people who are on the outside. People who are outcasts. People who are lonely. People who are hurting and for whatever reasons are sidelined and on the margins or beyond the margins. Jesus died for them. And so we're called as his followers to care for what Jesus died for. And that includes the lonely. And one of the things that strikes me as we think about the death of Jesus and the sufferings of Jesus, we often focus on his physical suffering and torment, and indeed it must have been unbearable. We think about the spiritual suffering that Jesus endured, but I think it's easy sometimes for us to overlook the fact that as Jesus died, one of the things that he experienced was remarkable loneliness. As Jesus went through his life, he was increasingly rejected and turned away from the religious leaders and authorities of his people. They either wanted nothing to do with him or they wanted to destroy him. So he's rejected by the leaders of his people. We know that in his final hours, he was abandoned by his own friends. And then when he was on the cross, one of those most mysterious expressions that we can grapple with in all of Scripture, one that I don't know exactly what all to make of it, but Jesus certainly expressed, I think, his sentiment, his feeling in the moment as he was stretched out between heaven and earth, nailed to a cross. He cried those poignant words, my God, why have you forsaken me?" The one who from all eternity had dwelt in the bosom of the Father now is in a position where he feels utterly forsaken, bereft of friend and every comfort and protection imaginable. This is the way the writer of Hebrews describes it in chapter 13, beginning in verse 11. He says that the high priest, talking about the animal sacrifices of the Jewish people and comparing that to Jesus' suffering on the cross, he said the high priest carries the blood of animals, those that are sacrificed, into the most holy place as a sin offering. But the bodies of those animals that were sacrificed, he says, are burned outside the camp. That is, the skin, the carcass of the animal would be taken outside as a thing of refuse, as trash, as something deplorable, rejected, and taken outside the city and burned. And then the writer says this about Jesus in connection with that, the next verse. In this way, and so Jesus also suffered outside the city gate in order to make his people holy through his own blood. So there's some sort of interesting juxtaposition of these concepts. Jesus' blood in the holy place, as it were, is making a way for his people to enter in, while Jesus himself, like An animal carcass of a sacrificed animal is taken outside the city, and though he's not burned, he is utterly abandoned and rejected. And so Jesus is lonely. Jesus is in exile in order that we may be brought in. But you know, when you think about Jesus' entire time on earth, you come to the realization that his entire earthly existence was sort of a lonely exile. For isn't it the case that Jesus left his home at his Father's side in order to descend into a world where he would be born and laid in a feeding trough, out in a barn? And why? Because there was no room for him in the inn. There was no place for him on the inside. And so even in his birth, he is on the outside. And then as he went through his ministry, or before he even entered his ministry, we know that he had to flee with his family down to Egypt. And he was literally an exile from his homeland, living in a foreign land as he grows up. And finally, when Herod dies, he's able to return home. And as he begins his ministry, he describes it this way. He said, "The birds of the air have their nests, and the foxes have their holes, but the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head." And so we see him in the Gospels wandering from place to place without a home. No wonder the prophet described him as a man despised and rejected, a man of sorrows, well acquainted with grief. There's a song we sometimes sing that I think captures this very poignantly as it focuses in on his experience in the Garden of Gethsemane when it says, "See that suffering, friendless one, weeping, praying all alone." And yet, as we read the Gospels, there is this stunning and striking contrast between Jesus' own experience of loneliness and exile from heaven, from his Father's bosom, into a world where he is homeless and where he is without the comforts and security that he had come to know in his existence in heaven. While he is in exile on earth, he also, ironically, becomes the ultimate host. By being the ultimate exile, he becomes the ultimate host. He was like an oasis of heaven on earth that attracted other people who were on the outs to him, that they could in him in some way begin to find home. They could find something that felt secure. There was provision and protection, and there was fellowship and companionship in the circle of Jesus. Oh, to have been one of his disciples, without any of the comforts of a stable home situation, but yet to be in his presence as he wandered from place to place must have felt like home to his disciples. And we see that the scriptures actually portray him in some interesting ways as this ultimate host. Just the Gospel of John alone, we could do this in the other Gospels as well, but just focusing on it, he begins his public ministry in John the 2nd chapter by performing that first miracle, that first public miracle to demonstrate his power, when he turns the water into wine. But where did he do that at? He was at a wedding celebration. And what happened was, it was the responsibility of the host to provide the drinks for all of the guests, and they ran out, which apparently was just the greatest social faux pas that you could commit in the day. The host had failed in their duty and responsibility to their guest. And so Jesus steps into the situation and provides an abundance of the highest quality wine that anyone there had ever tasted. And so Jesus becomes the host. He becomes the ultimate host. And it goes on, we come to John chapter 6, and there he has the multitude that has come out into a desert place, far away from all of the comforts of home, and they are hungry. What are we going to do, the disciples say? And Jesus says, have them sit down. And they bring him one little boy's lunch, and Jesus begins to make it into an abundance. And he feeds and he feeds and he feeds the people until all have had all that they wanted. Over 5,000 men, not counting the women and children. We've hosted some things, Janice and I, Janice mostly. I mow the yard and blow off the driveway. She takes care of the rest. But it's a big job having people over and providing a meal for people. But can you imagine feeding over 5,000 people? What kind of host would you have to be to do this? Jesus is the ultimate exile, but he is also the ultimate host. He does something a little bit later in the Gospel of John in chapter 13. When after having had a meal with the disciples, he girded himself with a towel, took off his robe, girded himself with a towel, got on his hands and knees, poured a basin of water, and began to wash the disciples' feet. We often think of this as an act of humility, and indeed it was, humility and service. But in the ancient world, this was also an expression of hospitality. It was standard operating procedure that when guests came into your home, you greeted them and you washed their feet from the filth that was a part of the streets in the ancient world. And so Jesus fulfills this humble role of being the host even to his own disciples. And then on the eve of his death, that same evening, he gathers with the 12 and he tells them that he, their host, is going to leave. And having been a part of that fellowship, having been a part of that companionship, having perhaps for many of them felt like they were kind of on the outside for various reasons, had been brought in by Jesus, are understandably troubled by what they hear. And so Jesus says to them in John 14, beginning in verse 1, he says, "Let not your hearts be troubled. You believe in God, believe also in me. For in my Father's house," what a beautiful word, house, my Father's house. "In my Father's house are many rooms." It's a big place, and there's ample place for you. And if they weren't that way, I would have told you, he says, "and I'm going to prepare a place," he says, "for you." And he continues saying, "If I go and prepare a place for you, I will come again and receive you to myself, that where I am, there you may be also." You see, Jesus had come this far in order to gather them around them and to make them into his brothers, his spiritual family. But he says, there's a little bit further journey I have to take. I have to go a little bit more. But I'm going there in order, deeper exile, in order that I may ultimately come back to where I began, in the Father's house. And when I do so, I'm going to make it right for you to be able to come. And ultimately, I'm going to receive you to myself, and I'm going to be there, and you're going to be there, and we're going to be there together. And this is a place of perfect peace and harmony and protection and provision and security. And no one will ever, ever, ever be lonely here again. Do we see what is taking place? Do we understand this? We're a race of people. There's only one human race. We're all descended from the same family, and our entire race has ever been in exile, ever since our first mother and father disobeyed God and were driven out of Eden. And not only that, we seem to be akin to Cain, who, after he murdered his brother, was not only driven out of the garden, but driven out of the land and forced to wander out, as it were, in the wilds and in the desert places, and complained, "My punishment is more than I can bear." So much so that eventually people come together and decide at Babel, we're just going to build a tower. We're going to make a city. We're going to provide protection, make a name for ourselves, have our own security and everything that we need. We can have heaven on earth. In fact, our tower is going to reach into heaven and span the gap. And we can do this under our own power and by our own initiative. And God looks down upon their project and says, "No, not really. It's a cheap imitation of the true home that we all yearn for, that we try to build." And so often we're like the sojourners that much of the Old Testament is about, the children of Israel, particularly in that 40-year period where they are wandering through the wilderness, exiles in search of a home, in search of a land flowing with milk and honey, a place where there's fortifications and security, where they'll have everything that they need. We feel that as we walk through this world that is so often filled with woe. And so Jesus became the ultimate outcast, the wanderer, the exile, in order that he may bring us to such a place. Which brings me back then to Hebrews, the 13th chapter, where we started. Let me just read it again to remind you. It says there that Jesus also suffered like these sacrificed animals, their carcasses thrown outside the city gates and burned. So Jesus also suffered outside the city gate to make the people, that's you and me, to make us holy through his own blood. And so what should we do in response to this? He says, well, here's the application. Then let us go to him outside the camp, bearing the disgrace that he bore. You know, since Jesus came out to get us in order to bring us back in and make us holy so that we can come back in, we should be willing to go out where he is. And I think that what he means by that is that for the people of the book of Hebrews, the Jews to whom he is writing in the first century, he's telling them, don't return to Jerusalem, which was their temptation, because they felt like if they went back to Jerusalem and back to Judaism that they had grown up in, that they could find security, they could find fellowship, and they could find all the abundance that they needed. And the writer is telling them, no, don't go back there. That city's not going to last. It's set for destruction. Instead, go out to Jesus. Continue in your exile with him, bearing whatever disgrace is necessary in order to be in Jesus' companionship and in the fellowship of his people. And here's why, he says, for here, in this realm, we do not have an enduring city. Don't look to Jerusalem. Don't look to Bowling Green. Don't look to the United States of America and think you found it. Here is utopia. Here is perfection. We've built it for ourselves, and this will last forever, and it's all that our hearts long for. Here we do not have that. But we're looking for the city. We're looking for the city that is to come. We're looking for the city that Jesus is at work preparing in the Father's house, and a place that we can return and have everything that we ever longed for and needed, and all that we have lost, and so much more will be given to us if we'll just keep our focus on that. But the question is, how are we to do that? And what does it have to do with the topic of our series, one another? And I think the answer is it's much in every way. In this same chapter, the idea is running throughout it, and it started off in verse 1 with this. He says, keep on loving one another, brothers and sisters. Keep on having that. Philadelphia is the word that in the Greek is used. This love for those who are like you, love for your brothers and sisters. Keep on loving each other. You're like the sojourners in the wilderness. You're like Cain wandering around in exile. You're like Adam and Eve cast out of the garden, but you've got each other. And Christ has created for us an oasis in this world, and we can band together and be as one, and we can have a family, and we can have some security in that in this world. And so keep on loving one another, brothers and sisters. But also, he says, don't become so focused inward that you forget about those who have not yet been brought into the family of God. So he says, do not forget to show hospitality to strangers. And there seems to be almost a little play on words here. The word Philadelphia for keep on loving your brothers is set in contrast or in comparison alongside the word philoxania here, or philozino, which is the love of strangers. So keep loving your brothers, but don't forget about those who have not yet been brought into the family of God. Keep on loving them as well and showing them the hospitality that they need. And then he adds something that's pretty interesting, and you get this for free of charge, as they say. He says, for by doing so, that is showing hospitality to strangers, some have entertained angels without knowing it. They've opened up their home to sojourners coming by and welcomed them in and washed their feet and killed for them the fatted calf and gave them security and a place to rest from their travels. And what's he referring to there? You remember the Old Testament story of Abraham and Sarah? when the 3 strangers showed up at their door and he provided those services for them? And he had no idea that it was 2 angels, and perhaps one of them even what we call a theophany, a pre-incarnate appearance of the Son of God himself. That's who he had brought into his home. And so we need to continue to open our hearts, open our church, open our houses to those who have not yet come to know the sweet fellowship that we have found in Christ, who do not yet have the same hope of ultimate reconciliation in the Father's house, that we'll be there with the Father and with the Son, with the Holy Spirit, and with all of the redeemed of all of the ages. We want to welcome others into this. And so he says to continue to remember those who are in prison, because sometimes you can't even bring people into your household because they can't come. So you need to take hospitality and export it to where they are. We need to think about those. I think about some who have here volunteered at places like hospitals for countless hours, trying to bring a little piece of home to people who are in a difficult and trying time of their life. And those who minister to those who are in jail here, exporting their heart and their hospitality to give some comfort to people who are in a terrible place. And then he adds, also remember those who are mistreated, as if you were yourselves suffering with them. This is the idea of sympathy and empathy, a Christian ideal that was unknown in the Roman world for the most part, and yet we take it for granted. But it is something that we're called to do, is to consider the difficult situations of those who are on the outside and who are in need and who are suffering, and bring something to them or to bring them in. As he says in verse 16, don't forget to do good and to share with those who are in need, for these are the sacrifices that please God. In 1 Peter 4, verse 9, we're told to be hospitable to one another without grumbling. You can't grumble. And he says in Romans 12:13 that Christians are to be given to hospitality. Give yourself over to this, to welcoming others in. And there's a reason why we need to do that. I love the way John Piper puts this in one of his writings. He says, when we practice hospitality, we experience the refreshing joy of becoming conduits of God's grace. A means through which God's grace flows. It flows to us, but through us to others. And what a wonderful thing that is. It's a refreshment to us and to the others that we bring it to. And we can be that, conduits of God's hospitality, rather than being, I love this phrase, self-decaying cul-de-sacs. Let me ask you, are you a conduit of hospitality? Of the same Jesus who put himself out in order to bring you in? Have you received that blessing from him, but it dead ends with you? It's just a self-decaying cul-de-sac. Or are you a person of a flow-through spirit, where all the abundance and acceptance and grace and mercy and love and fellowship and hope and happiness that you have found in Christ flows through you to others who are where you used to be? Practicing the Christian faith is therefore about fleeing the faux hospitality of the world, the kind that you see on Pinterest and Facebook and whatever other social media websites that we go to, that picture for us this idea of cleanliness and perfection, and sometimes intimidates us and think, well, we can't show hospitality because we aren't Martha Stewart. That's not what it's about. And that's not what our hearts are craving. It's receiving the true hospitality that we have received from the ultimate host, who was the ultimate exile, in order to bring us in, and then turning outward to share what we have found with others. Tim Keller, I think, puts it this way, as a clear understanding of it as we could possibly get. Here's what we do, both as individuals, as families, households, and as a congregation. We turn guests into acquaintances. Those who show up, those that God puts in our path, we bring them in and we get to know them. We make them acquaintances, and then we turn acquaintances into friends. It's purposeful. And bringing them into our realm of friendship, we at last hope to bring them into our family, that they may enjoy that same thing that those disciples must have enjoyed as they clustered around Jesus, moving from place to place. And so what do? Making it as practical as possible, we need to be on the lookout for people. We need to look out for the lonely. Do you know anybody who's lonely? Do you know anybody who's isolated? Show them hospitality. Maybe the newcomer who shows up at your workplace or in your neighborhood. Be the first one to greet them. And then those who have gone through extraordinarily difficult and trying times that cause people to feel loneliness, the divorced and those who have been widowed. And maybe those who are all around us who have tons of acquaintances, lots of social media friends and likes and whatnots, but have very few real friends. Become the friend that they truly need. And I want to close by asking you to consider why, the ultimate why behind all of this. And I think that this passage that I'm going to put up, which is my modification, it's the Lawrence Kelly translation, but it's a pretty close translation. But I want us to think about it as something that should be moving to all of us because it describes our experience, whether it's something we've had first generationally or whether it's something that's come to us through a few generations ahead, but something that all of us have experienced that'll move us in this direction. And it's just simply Ephesians chapter 2, verses 12 and 13 rendered this way. Not long ago, you were outsiders. You were excluded from citizenship among God's people. And you did not know the promises God had made. You lived in the world without God, without hope. For some of you, you're like, yes, I definitely remember that. I've been there. I've been on the outside. I know what that feels like. And then he adds in verse 13, but now, Christ has sought you out. You who were far away from God have been brought near to him. How? Through the blood of Christ. Why don't we show hospitality? Whether it's inviting someone into our apartment, our home, taking them out to a restaurant to get to know them, spending time with a difficult person at the workplace, seeking out those at the hospital or at the funeral home or others that we know who are going through grievous times. Why do we avoid that? We avoid it because it puts me out. It may cost me money. It will cost you money. It's going to take time. And so we stack up all of these reasons why it's just too inconvenient for me to be put out in this way. But Jesus was put out cosmically, absolutely, utterly. He went out, he went down, he went far, far, far away from the heart, from the bosom of the Father, in which he had all of the comforts, everything that you can imagine, and so much more. And he left all of that behind in order to seek you out. You on the outside, you wandering, you lost, you without knowledge of the hope and the comfort of Christ. He found you and brought you in, made you a part of the family. And because he's done that for you, you should do that for someone else. That's the logic of the New Testament. And it is the reason why the early church exploded in the first few centuries. Because they were known above all people in the Roman Empire for their hospitality and care for the widow, for the orphan, for the traveler. And through that, the gospel spread from person to person. And those who were outside were brought inside. And that's our task. And it's a blessing because it makes us a conduit of fresh provision and not a self-decaying cul-de-sac. If you're not a Christian this morning, we want to offer the hope of Jesus Christ to you once more. He has come for you to bring you in. He was willing to be put out so that you could be brought in. What a disaster for him to have done so and for you not to avail yourself of that gift. So this morning, we encourage you, if you have that need, to come to Christ and he will receive you. And we'll help you to put him on in baptism or do whatever we can to help you take the next step toward him and toward home. Why don't you come while we stand and while we sing?